So with e-bikes becoming more and more popular over the years, I've been hitting the gym so that I've got the upper body strength to lift these things in and out of the back of my truck. Well, it turns out that was just a giant waste of time, and I can stick with these little noodle arms. Santa Cruz just dropped the Heckler SL today, so we're gonna talk about it. It's light, fast, fun, and incredibly purple. So stick around to see if it's the right e-bike for you. Okay, so let's start with the Heckler SL itself before we get to the E-parts. The Heckler SL shares a lot of DNA with its bigger brother, the Heckler. So like the big full power Heckler, the SL has 150 millimeters of rear wheel travel and 160 up front. Unlike the other Heckler, the SL only comes with a 27.5-inch rear wheel, making it a mullet setup. It does share similar geometry, but it's not quite identical. Here we have a 64-degree head tube angle. We have a 497 millimeter reach in my size extra large frame. We've got size specific chainstays, with mine being 447 millimeters in extra large. Do all that math, put it all together, and you have a 1295 millimeter wheelbase. And because everybody's going to want to know, on my super accurate $7 Walmart special, the Heckler SL weighs 231.7 minus 40 pounds. Although Santa Cruz does claim a weight of 41 pounds, so maybe they have a better scale than mine. So the Heckler SL uses the Fazua Ride 60 drive system. This is the system I have the least amount of experience with, but so far I've been really happy with it on this bike and the transition relay. Like its name implies, it has 60 Newton meters of peak torque, putting it kind of near the top of the mid-power category. The Shimano EP8 RS found on the Orbea Rise also has 60 Newton meters, but most fall somewhere below that, kind of in that 50 mark. So this thing has a 430 watt-hour battery, but with less power drawn from the motor, it's kind of about a 630 watt-hour equivalent on a full power e-bike. One of the things I really like about the Fazua system is the lack of drag. So if your battery dies, you can pedal this thing pretty okay. I mean, it's heavy, but you can still pedal it. One thing to note about the Heckler SL is this has an integrated battery. So you're not getting this thing out without a beverage, some tools, and someone to hold the flashlight straight. You're gonna have to pull that motor. On one hand, it is nice to be able to hot swap batteries trailside for really big rides. And on the other, this down tube is really sleek and pretty stealthy, and there's not a big hole cut in your down tube, potentially making the front of the frame pretty flexy. So one of my complaints about the Fazua Ride 60 on the transition relay was this little guy, the little ring controller. On that bike, you'd push it up and it would get stuck. It'd stay there. It wouldn't snap back to its spot where it should. This is the newer style and it has been fixed, and I have not had any problems with it sticking so far. So a couple last details about this bike. You had better like carbon if you want this bike, because it only comes in carbon. There's two styles, you got the C and the CC. This bike in particular is a GX axis build. So C frame, GX axis drivetrain, and the aluminum reserve wheels. This bike retails for $9,699, but builds do range from $7,299 all the way up to $12,999. So now let's get to the good part. All right, so the Heckler SL is unmistakably Santa Cruz from the second you throw a leg over it. It has a tall front end, a pretty active suspension feel, and it offers tons and tons of traction. And this has a comfortable fit and feel, and then you pair that with the Fazua Ride 60, and this bike is great for long days out in the mountains. It is a competent climber that starts to shine, especially when the trail gets rough. So starting with the suspension performance. The Heckler SL is on the active side of things, just where you'd want an e-bike to be. Efficiency is less of a priority when there's a motor involved. Instead, traction becomes the name of the game, applying that extra juice from the drive system towards forward progress. The Heckler SL provides gobs and gobs of traction, helping propel you up some rough, steep, and loose climbs. In fact, I spent a day trying to climb various moto trails, and our long winter and high spring runoff did a number on those trails, making them particularly heinous. While I wish I could say I cleaned them all, I did clean far more than I would have imagined. The bike's ability to smooth out bumps and keep both wheels on the ground is pretty impressive. The Heckler SL's geometry is on the slack and long side with a pretty relaxed riding position. Despite the tall front end, I didn't find the front wheel wandering too much or lifting when things got steep. E-bikes are particularly sensitive to light front ends as there's more torque trying to lift them up. Heckler SL stayed planted and was easy to control. I would imagine the longer rear center comes into play here, keeping my weight centered over the bike, especially when the grades got steep. The Heckler SL is roughly 8 to 12 pounds lighter than most full power e-bikes. That does become noticeable on the climbs, both in terms of handling characteristics and the E parts, which we'll talk about in just a bit. Now, I'm not much of a weight weenie, but a 10-pound difference is something I'll certainly notice. The Heckler SL's handling is light, quick, and natural, and it's not a wrestling match around every corner or every time you need to unweight and change lines. It's very much like a pedal bike in that regard. So now, talking about the E parts. The Fazua Ride 60 is quickly becoming a contender in the mid-power category. I understand there have been some reliability concerns when it first launched, but I've spent a fair amount of time riding it on a handful of bikes over the last few months with no problems. I'm impressed by its range and noise levels. It is a quiet little Energizer bunny. My biggest ride on the Heckler SL so far has been about 16 miles with 4,000 vert, and I still had 15% battery left after it was all said and done. Remember, I tend to ride e-bikes in full boost, especially when I'm testing, so that range is plenty for full boost weekday rides and should do just fine on longer weekend missions with a bit more judicial use of the battery. The interface on this is very sleek with the top tube mounted display and the ring controller. I also like how the motor is fully nestled inside the down tube. You don't see it sticking out down by the bottom bracket. That does keep the bike extra stealthy. Now, this motor doesn't have the most refined and natural feel, however. It's a bit more on-off than it is like a smooth ramp up to full power. Other systems seem to match the rider's power output a little bit better and provide a bit more natural ride experience in that regard. That said, the Fazua will provide plenty of assistance in a reliable way to get you to the top of the mountain. The power to weight ratio is spot on here. The power output is enough to keep the bike quick when paired with a lightweight frame and build. With a little extra effort on your part, you could probably hang with the big full power dogs, but maybe not the whole ride. So overall on the climbs, the Heckler SL does a pretty good job of getting you to the top of the mountain. It offers plenty of power, especially considering how lightweight the whole system is, and when things get rough and technical, it really starts to shine. So now talking about the downhill, this is the part where that reduction in power really starts to pay off. This is where it becomes worth having 20 Newton meters less power and a smaller battery. The Heckler SL's downhill handling characteristics can't be beaten. It's easily one of, if not the best handling EMTBs I've ever ridden. Between the suspension design, geometry, and lightweight platform, it's some of the most fun you can have on two wheels. So, starting with the suspension design, the Heckler SL offers an unrivaled, plush, smooth, and controlled ride quality. It feels soft off the top, likely with a little bit of help from a bit more weight on the frame than a pedal bike would have. It gets into that mid-stroke easily enough, but without feeling dead and boring. And there's plenty of ramp up at the end to smash the bike into big hits with no regard for human safety. The suspension is probably my favorite thing about this bike. It handles high-speed, rough terrain really well, yet it somehow handles smooth terrain and jumps just as well. Just like the big full-power Heckler, this thing is a bit of a unicorn. The Heckler SL's geometry is on the long and slack side, putting the bike squarely in the middle of the all-mountain and enduro categories. It's slack enough to handle steep and rough descents, yet not so slack it becomes a chore to ride on mellower terrain. It hits that sweet spot for me, for a bike that I can take anywhere and ride any trail. You're unlikely to ever feel outgunned, and you'll only ever feel overbiked on the easiest and flattest trails. While this bike certainly skews to more aggressive riding, I still enjoyed it on smooth, cruisy blues. With the smaller back wheel, the handling remains quick and agile, and the suspension keeps it pretty lively. Let's talk a bit more about the Heckler SL's cornering ability. If you're a fan of cutties, smacking berms, and hitting corners faster than you have any business doing, you're gonna be a big fan of this thing. On my first ride out, I couldn't stop giggling in every corner. I think it comes down to the weight distribution, the smaller back wheel, and the traction provided by that suspension design. Whatever it is, the bike corners incredibly well. And I thought this same thing about the 5010, and the Heckler SL might just be even better. This bike has a degree of stability and control combined with this cornering prowess that's just tough to beat. For an e-bike, the Heckler SL logs some serious air miles. I should probably restate that. For any bike, the Heckler SL is really good at getting off the ground. It wants to unweight and hop over everything. And it's really easy to bunny hop, which is a bit rare for an e-bike. The lightweight platform certainly helps, but I think the suspension plays a big role here too. I had so much fun jumping the bike that I ended up getting myself into some pretty dumb situations. I'd jump into nasty, rocky landings or into tight corners with no regard for future Connor. Overall, the Heckler SL is one of the best handling e-bikes that I have ever ridden. It feels distinctly unlike an e-bike in all of the best ways on the descents. So let's chat for a minute about other bikes that came to mind while I was out riding the Heckler SL. I want to keep this pretty short and brief because we are working on a lightweight EMTB showdown and I don't want to give it all away, but we'll get into a couple comparisons here. The first bike that comes to mind is the Orbea Rise, and now I have spent more time on that bike than any other EMTB. I love that bike for its natural ride quality and rather incredible range. Both the Heckler SL and the Rise fall in the lightweight e-bike categories, although the Rise can be built significantly lighter, with some builds coming in at the 36-pound mark. The Rise uses the Shimano EP8 RS motor, which I feel is a bit more natural than the Fazua Ride 60. It is louder, however. The Rise also offers a bigger battery option that, when paired with a 60 Nm motor, makes for some incredible range. The Rise feels a bit more trail, with less travel, a firmer suspension platform, and sharper handling. The Heckler SL is easily the more capable descender though, with a much more plush and planted feel. Now let's talk about the transition relay. I just rode and reviewed this bike. The E parts are identical. They both use the Fazua Ride 60. A couple of differences though. The relay's battery is easily removable without the need for tools, whereas the Heckler SL's battery is integrated. The relay is also designed to be ridden without the battery installed for a quasi pedal bike experience. The Heckler SL wins a few points in my book for having an external charging port, which for some reason the relay does not have. As far as ride quality goes, both bikes look rather similar on paper. Their suspension qualities are fairly different, however. The Heckler SL feels more plush and controlled in the rough, whereas the relay translates more trail chatter through to the rider. The relay is also a few pounds heavier for those counting. Who is the Heckler SL for? I really like this bike for three different groups of riders. The first group is the group that I belong to. I love e-bikes for their ability to open up new terrain and to maximize downhill riding time. But I don't want my bike to feel like a school bus. I want a fun, lively bike with excellent handling. And the Heckler is just that. It's just enough E on the climbs without compromising the fun on the downhills. It is one of the most analog feeling descenders that I've ridden. The next group is the gateway e-bikers. These folks aren't fully committed to the e-bike life, or they're not even sure if it's for them. The Heckler SL is a great option for dipping a toe in the water. It isn't as heavy as the big dogs, and it doesn't ride too much unlike a pedal bike. It could have a bit more natural feeling motor, but as far as ride quality goes, it's going to be a very familiar experience to what someone has on their pedal bike. The last group who I think will like the Heckler SL is the small riders group. Now, I'm a bigger guy, so riding a full power and heavy e-bike isn't as overwhelming as it might be for a small rider. I weigh 195 pounds, so a 50-pound bike is, roughly a quarter of my body weight. A petite 125-pound rider on a 50-pound bike is a different story though. That ends up being almost 40% of their body weight, and that's a really big difference. If you can take 10 pounds off that bike though, starting to get a lot more reasonable. I think smaller riders who are looking for an e-bike will enjoy the Heckler SL for not only the weight savings, but also the tire to butt clearance of that smaller 27.5-inch wheel. It will be much less of a wrestling match for that size rider. So let's wrap this bad Larry up with a one-line bike review. The Heckler SL provides some of the best handling and most fun characteristics of any EMTB on the market currently. So thanks for sticking around. Stay tuned for those future showdowns and comparisons, and we'll see you next time.